We're glad you joined us for our Wednesday night Bible study. I'm predicting that things are going to go back to normal by the end of June, or by the beginning of June, and we'll probably be entering into our summer series. That's above my pay grade. I hadn't been told that. That's something that I have surmised. So for the month of May, we've decided to kind of do a short course or just a few short studies, and I wanted to analyze. I guess analyze is maybe a bad word, but I want to talk about the teaching of Jesus, and going to use kind of as our case study the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And as we study the Sermon on the Mount, I want you to look for these components. A vast majority of the dialogue that we have from Jesus is in response to questions. It's Jesus talking to people about controversy. It's Jesus answering questions. But when he gets a chance to just do an agenda-based lesson, where Jesus sits down with a crowd and begins to do some teaching, it's pretty eclectic. He covers a lot of territory, but you'll notice these components. Every time that Jesus speaks, and it's not in response to somebody's question, it seems that it's always, number one, God-focused first. He points people to the Father. He points people to His Father. He points people toward God. He will always indicate that a relationship with God yields a behavioral change. Never the idea that behavior equals relationship with God. Jesus will say that relationship with God affects our morals, and he's going to really emphasize that we are not possessive of inherent goodness, that our behavioral change comes because we are in a relationship with God, not the other way around. And Jesus will also focus on internals versus externals. He'll talk about what's inside a man way more than he'll talk about what's outside a man. And again, when he talked about internals versus externals, it's going to be about spiritual disciplines, the difference between a relationship and a ritual, and he'll also talk about that this internals versus externals, an internal locus of control is going to be that which monitors our morals, and it's not the other way around. And then, basically, as you listen to the teaching of Jesus and as we analyze this, look for these components that when we get in tune with God, when our lives line up with God, it's going to balance the way we respond to circumstances, things, and people. And so really in my mind, when I think about the things that Jesus taught, I kind of see this, I guess you'd call it a hierarchy, that you put God before people, you put people before things, and you recognize that good things come from God. It's not about what we deserve. God is a benevolent God. He blesses everybody. As we study the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will even talk about, it rains on the just and the unjust. You don't deserve rain, you get it. But the good things we have come before God. And if we understand that God gives us blessings to serve Him, serving God involves serving other people. So then we recognize that the things that we have materially belong to God. And because they belong to God, they really belong to you, because I'm going to share them with you, and then it's my responsibility to use them as a steward. So things belong to God. Because they belong to God, I'm to share them with you. Technically, they belong to you then. And then I look at my stewardship, not necessarily the things that I possess. So with those things kind of in a backdrop or kind of in mind, let's look at the first part of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the first part of the Sermon on the Mount is going to be an introduction about internals, because we start with a series of attitudes, and we call these the Beatitudes. Some people call them the beautiful attitudes. Some people have said they're the attitudes to be. You're going to get a series of statements, and in each of those series of statements, Jesus is going to use the word blessed. Now, I tease the young preaching students and some of the guys that, for whatever reason, maybe it's because of the way we sing songs, but the word is blessed, not blessed. Okay, it's just blessed. It sounds more churchy. It sounds more holy to go blessed, but it's not blessed. It's blessed. Okay, and blessed comes from an idea that happiness or contentment is not based on circumstances. He's using a word that these people would understand the state of the gods. That blessed was a situation where it's an internal locus of control and it has nothing to do with my external circumstances. So as he begins the Sermon on the Mount, his lead-off batter is going to be, he's going to establish that there's an attitude toward God and attitudes toward people that are going to affect the way that we live and the way that we respond to life. So, Matthew chapter 5. Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Now, the reason we stop there is because the first four of these attitudes are really about a response to God. They're an understanding of how we relate to God, and once we get that relationship with God under control, then we have some responsibilities to relate to people. If you look at the Old Covenant and the Ten Commandments, the first half are people and God, the next half is people and people. If you were present for our study in Ephesians, you understand that when you study the book of Ephesians, the cross is the plus sign of the universe, bringing God and people together and people together. So when Jesus starts out in his earthly teaching, he says, let's establish some attitudes that have to do with God. Number one, blessed are the poor in spirit. Basically, blessed are people who are not spiritually arrogant. There is a group of people who think that they possess inherent righteousness. There are people who think that they are morally excellent or morally superior, and it's because of a works righteousness or because of a deed-oriented thing. The Pharisees in the New Testament were a meritocracy. They thought their righteousness came because they were experts in keeping the minutiae of the law. And they were pretty black and white thinkers. You know, it had to be their way or the highway. There was no wiggle room in between. And because of that, they tended to look down on people. Now, there's exceptions for every case, and I'm painting a big stereotype on the Pharisees. There were some good Pharisees. But by and large, these guys thought of themselves as the experts and the gatekeepers to the kingdom. When Jesus talks about the scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew 23, you'll understand that it's all about internals versus externals as well from a negative standpoint. And so when Jesus talks to this audience, he goes, you're going to be blessed. You're going to be happy. You're going to have this inner state when you are not spiritually arrogant. In a lesson, Are You Righteous or Merely Religious? A manuscript that my brother wrote, I guess either while he was in college or while I was in college, and I got to read it. It's unpublished. I wish he'd, get on Kindle Publishing and publish it. But in that handwritten manuscript, it basically says you recognize what you are without God. These attitudes are not being spiritually arrogant is when I look at who God is and who I am, I suddenly recognize who I'm not. And that leads to a sense of blessedness because it's simply the idea that I don't have to worry about things I'm not in control of. And if I'm not God, then there's some things that I get to relax about. It seems like every internet post, lots of things that I hear spoken publicly, everybody is assuming that everybody's anxious about COVID. And the truth is, you look at what you can control, and you look at what you can do. You control the controllables and you do the doables. And once you've done that, you don't have to worry. If it's beyond my control, I don't have to worry about it. It will sort itself out or it won't. But why should I spend time worrying about it? Recognizing that God is supreme in the universe and there are some things I don't get to vote on. There's some things that are above my pay grade. Once we recognize who I am without God, it creates a need for me. Recognizing that this is God and this is me. And when I recognize that God's in control of these things and I'm not, recognizing who I am without God, not being spiritually arrogant, leads me to a place of seeking peace, because once I give the control over to God, that solves a lot of my problems. That dispels a lot of my anxiety. That gets rid of a lot of my worries, because I don't have to worry about this. God's in charge of it. I get teased a lot about the weather. I guess everybody thinks that, preachers have a hotline to God on who controls the weather. And my standard response, I stole it from somebody else, is, hey, I'm in sales, not management. And understanding that it's above my pay grade. So blessed are the poor in spirit is understanding, recognizing who I am without God. And once I recognize, not being spiritually arrogant, recognizing who I am without God, it leads to a second attitude. Blessed are those who mourn. If I can come to the realization that this is God and this is me, and I recognize that difference, I'm going to regret what I am without God. Realizing what I am without God should lead me to a place to say, when I look at myself and I see His righteousness, I see His love, I see His mercy, I see His holiness, I see His perfection, and I look at myself, that leads me to a place that says, I've got to be different. I've got to change. I've got to have a response to God's holiness and my unholiness. I've got to have a response to God's righteousness and my unrighteousness. So making that recognition causes me to move, causes me to have an impetus in my life, a catalyst, if you will, to walk forward and try to find God. So get rid of spiritual arrogance. I'm not inherently righteous. I don't have the keys to the kingdom. I'm not a gatekeeper for relationships. I can't say this person's worthy, this person's not. I've got to get out of my own way and recognize who I am without God. Recognizing who I am without God sends me to a place of regret. Not a despondent regret, but the godly sorrow that works for repentance that leads to salvation. So once I realize who I am without God, and then I regret who I am without God, I go, how do I fix that? Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, and blessed are the meek. And meekness is the idea of turning over my will, turning over my power, turning over my control, and allowing someone else to be in charge. So when I understand who I am without God, and I regret who I am without God, I go, what can I do to fix this? And the only way to fix that gap, the only way for me to take my unholiness and my unrighteousness and my imperfection and move forward is to submit to God's will. There's a famous relationship expert. They do a 3-day or 4-day intensive saving marriages. They claim they have an 80% success rate. And the question they ask when you walk into one of their seminars is, are you willing to do anything it takes to save your marriage? And that's a yes or no question. And the yes or no is determined whether you walk in the door or not. If you don't sign the paper and say, I'm willing to do anything it takes to save my marriage, they're not going to take your money, not going to waste your time, waste theirs either. But when you go, I am willing to do anything it takes to save my marriage, no wonder they have an 80% success rate, because people who come in the door are willing to work. Well, when I look at my life and I compare it to God and I recognize how empty and void and imperfect it is, and I go, you know what, I'm willing to do anything it takes to line up with what God has designed me to be, or to be closer to His nature, then what happens is I sign on the line. I'm willing to obey anything you say, therefore I'm meek. I'm giving my power over to God. I see the bumper sticker that says God is my co-pilot. Well, if God is your co-pilot, you're sitting in the wrong seat. God's flying the plane, or God's not in the plane. And so we recognize who we are without God. We regret who we are without God. And then we're willing to submit. We're willing to be meek. We're willing to give over our control to let God mold us into who He wants us to become. And then once we do that, it's a continued process of, you can call it sanctification, you can call it spiritual growth, you can call it spiritual disciplines, but blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they'll be filled. Jesus says when you decide that your sustenance, when you decide that what you crave, hunger and thirst, is not what the world offers, but what God offers. This is what I am without God. I regret what I am without God. I'm willing to do anything that God asked me to do to fulfill that. And then God says, well, this is your menu. This is the thing that you have to have. Then a person who becomes a craver of righteousness, not ticking off check marks, not going through rituals, but saying, what does a righteous life profess? What does a righteous life manifest? And it's understanding that my connection to God is going to produce these behaviors, and not that these behaviors produce the connection to God. So recognize who you are without God. Regret who you are without God. Be willing to submit your will to God to become more like Him. And then your obsession is perfecting my walk with God. I'm going to hunger. I'm going to thirst after righteousness. Now, once that happens, there's a change in how I respond to people. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says, once you have this relationship change with God, then you've got to have a relationship change with people. And the first thing that has to happen in getting along with people is mercy. Mercy is basically doing on a teeny tiny scale what God has done on a grand scale for us. I live my life understanding that I'm surrounded by imperfect people. I'm an imperfect person. I married an imperfect person. We work with imperfect people. We go to church with imperfect people. We gave birth to a child, and when she got old enough, she became an imperfect person. And when people become imperfect, how do we respond to that? We respond to it with mercy. We give them what they need, not what they deserve. I'm able to do on a small scale in someone else's life what God did for me on a grand scale. This is who God is. This is who I am. And God overlooked that, allowed me with my submission to Him to move closer. And that's what we do with people. So blessed are the merciful, for they shall be seen mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart. Now, pure in heart basically means that when I interact with people, that I don't do so on a deceptive or a duplicitous way. A pure in heart is basically that I treat you with emotions, and I treat you in such a way that is not about selfishness. So many times we garner relationships, we network, we befriend people because there's some benefit in that for us. God's relationship with us doesn't do anything for Him. God's relationship doesn't gain Him anything. God's relationship is unconditional acceptance of us when we're not deserving of it. Well, that should be our relationship with other people. That when we give people love, we give them an unconditional response, not based on what they can do for us, not based on how they can respond to us, not based on who they are, not based on their perceived power or any kind of advantage. We treat people the way we treat people out of a sincerity, out of a purity of heart. We, during the quarantine, we've adopted a dog. Now, the plan was Jackie's going to not have to go back to school after December. And so she was going to get a little show dog and spend her retirement training this little dog to either do obstacle courses or some kind of herding exercise or whatever. Well, her big idea is, hey, I'm not going back to school. The most this dog's ever going to be left at home is going to be for a few short months in the fall when I go back to school. So why don't we get a head start on training our dog? So yada, 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 during the COVID quarantine, we go to North Carolina and adopt a dog. And so we now have a little black and white Spanish water dog named Oreo. And Oreo doesn't know anything about us. We showed up, she left the kennel, went home with us, an 8-hour car ride, and she's been at our house for 2 weeks now. And you would think that when I leave her in the house and go to the mailbox and come back, it's like I've been to the moon. She can't believe I'm back in her life. She gets apoplectic when Jackie leaves. She just nearly goes crazy because she wants to be connected. Why? She loves us out of a purity and a sincerity. She has no reason to love us other than we're the people in her pack now. And that sincere love is she just loves us because we're there. And she responds that way to it's seemingly everything she runs into because she's a puppy. If we could respond to people with not who you are, with not what you make, not what you do, not what you can do for me, but you're there and you're going to get my love and my enthusiasm simply because you occupy the space in front of me. That's pretty cool. In fact, when Jesus talks about a neighbor, He gives the instructions, love your neighbor as yourself, and the lawyer said, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan and basically teaches the principle that your neighbor is anybody who falls into your radar scope. Opportunity equals responsibility. If I'm traveling and I run into you, you're my neighbor. If I see you in difficulty, you're my neighbor. And they typically define neighbor as a fellow Jew. And Jesus uses this Samaritan as an example to say a neighbor is someone that is on your radar scope. And you love people not based on who they are or your perception of them, but you love people out of a pure heart. So in getting along with people, we forgive them, we show mercy, have a pure heart. And then Jesus says you'll also be blessed. You'll have this internal sense of being at peace when you're also a peacemaker. And a peacemaker and a peace lover are very, very different. A peacemaker is someone who initiates a change. You know, oftentimes in a marriage counseling or even a marriage seminar, I'll ask the question, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best, you know, where's your relationship at? And I don't ask people to show me that number. That starts fights. I just, you have a number in your head. Now, think in your mind, if whatever your number was, what could immediately change to change that number from a 6 to a 7 to an 8, or whatever? 9 times out of 10 in a marriage counseling session or even in a discussion, they will say, if my spouse would. That's not being a peacemaker. A peacemaker is this question. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best, where's your marriage? And let's pretend you say a 7. A peacemaker says, what could I do today to make that 7 into an 8? And that's basically understanding that it's on, the impetus is on me. I'm the person who initiates good. I'm the person who goes out of my way to say, let's see what I can do to fix unfinished business. Later on, Jesus is going to talk about if you come to bring your gift to the altar and you know your brother has something against you, you leave your gift at the altar and go see your brother. It doesn't say your brother has a clue. Doesn't say your brother has a legitimate complaint. What it says is if you've got unfinished business with your brother and you know it's unfinished business on his side, has something against you, you initiate and you become a peacemaker. You'll notice that most of these things reflect an aspect of God, because God initiated a peace repair attempt with us. God loves us out of a pure heart, doesn't get any benefit out of it, and God is extremely merciful. So he's basically saying you take your relationship that you have with God, and you take that relationship with God, and you reflect it into the lives of other people. And then the last thing he's going to do when he establishes this groundwork for internals versus externals is he's going to say, blessed are those who are persecuted because of your righteousness, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is going to lay the foundation work of this attitude that our righteousness does not guarantee good circumstances. That our being, quote unquote, good people doesn't guarantee good things or good responses. It's the idea that I'm willing to do what God wants me to do regardless of the consequences. And when we live our lives that are not in fear of consequences, but they're internally driven. See, if I think about what's going to happen, how are they going to respond, what are they going to say, what are they going to think, then the outside world controls me. But if I say I'm going to be righteousness, I'm going to pursue righteousness, I'm going to try to be a righteous person, and it doesn't matter how the world responds to it. It doesn't matter what it costs me. It doesn't matter what opportunities I miss. It doesn't matter what difficult choices I have to make. I'm going to deal with persecution because the value of righteousness trumps or exceeds the value I place on those other things. I'm reading a book called Resilience, and one of the quotes in the book says, what you become is a direct product of what you're willing to suffer. And Jesus says, if you're willing to suffer because of your righteousness, it's easy to be righteous when people are bragging on you. It's easy to be righteous when people say you're a good guy. It's easy to be righteous when people are friendly to you. But what happens when you have to make a choice about right and wrong and good and evil, and it compromises some of those things, compromises some of those beliefs, compromises some of those friendships? Jesus said, you'll be blessed when your righteousness exceeds, your value of your righteousness exceeds your value for comfort or your value for things to be easy. So in these Beatitudes, Jesus lays the foundation. This is your attitude toward God. This is your attitude toward people. Now, once he establishes you've got to have these internal qualities, he's going to challenge the popular religious thinking of the day. This will introduce our next section for next Wednesday. We'll go ahead and read this. If you behave as people who are connected to God, and you behave as people connected to other people, here's what happens. Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do men light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. Jesus says, when you live this life, it's a life about influence, not about power. See, salt is an influencing agent. You can oversalt something, but something with no salt in it is tasteless. If the salt loses its ability to influence taste, if salt loses its saltiness, if salt loses its ability to preserve something, then you take that salt and it's worthless, you throw it out and you walk on it like dirt. When Jesus talks about living with these attitudes, he's talking about becoming people of influence. And influence is different than power. Notice that he talks about a candle or a lamp. A little bitty lamp, a little bitty candle can be seen from a far away place. A little bitty candle can light up a room, because when you put light in juxtaposition with darkness, it's not that the light has more power, but the light has more influence, because what a light brings to a dark room is illumination. And a little bitty light can be seen in a vast place of darkness. It can't dispel all the darkness, but it dispels the darkness in that small circle of influence. And when you light a lamp, you don't put it under a basket, you put it on a candlestick. Why? You elevate the light, it gives light to the house. If you've got a city on a hill, you know where that city is no matter how far away you are. So when Jesus talks about living these lifestyles, having this internal component, using these attitudes, he said if you do that, you become people of influence. You become salt, and you become light. Now, having laid the foundation of salt and having laid the foundation of light by being people who recognize who they are without God, regretting who they are without God, willing to submit their lives to God to become more like God, and then obsessing with hunger and thirsting for righteousness, we become people of forgiveness. We become people of pure motives. We become people of pure love. We become people who are peacemakers, and we become people of endurance. What that allows us to become is people of influence. And we have a change effect in the world around us, and we're salt and we're light. In our study next week, he's going to immediately confront his audience with the religious teachings of the day and say, you've heard it said, but I say to you. And he's going to talk about how when you put God first in an attitude, these are the internals versus the externals. And he's really going to talk about basically four things. He's going to talk about religious practices, morals, spiritual disciplines, how we balance materialism, what we think about the world condition, what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, and who's in charge of all that. And then he's going to talk about our relationship with other people. Those are the things that Jesus is going to talk about in his teaching, where you look at internals versus externals because of a God-first focus. So I look forward to studying the Sermon on the Mount with you based on an analysis of understanding how Jesus taught. Remember, there's a number on our screen. If you want to call our building and get in contact with somebody that we can help you, we want to be salt. We want to be light in our community. Give us a call. Let us help you. God bless you. Thank you for joining us.